January 17, 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The sky turned black before noon. It was not the darkness of monsoon clouds, nor the eclipse of sun behind mountain. It was something else, something unnatural, a wall of shadow that moved across the rice paddies like the hand of a wrathful god, blotting out the light, swallowing the horizon. The air tasted of metal and burning petroleum. The sound came next, not thunder, but a continuous roar that seemed to originate from the earth itself. A mechanical howl that made the ground vibrate beneath boots and bare feet alike. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army's 23rd Infantry Regiment crouched in his foxhole near the town of San Manuel, his rifle clutched against his chest. He was 22 years old. He had been in the Philippines for 8 months. Above him, the sky was no longer sky, it was flame and smoke, a churning mass of orange and black that rolled forward like an avalanche of fire. He pressed his face into the dirt, tasting soil and ash, and for the first time since leaving Yokohama Harbor, he understood that he might die not as a warrior, but as an insect beneath a boot. This was not how it was supposed to be. To understand the terror that gripped Hiroshi Tanaka and tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers across the Pacific Theater in 1945, one must journey backward through time to the promises made, the victories won, and the illusions carefully constructed by an empire that believed itself destined for greatness. In December 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed a fleet that rivaled any in the world. The army that swept through Southeast Asia in the months that followed moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned Western observers. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore, the fortress the British had declared impregnable, surrendered in 70 days. The Dutch East Indies, Burma, the Philippines all collapsed before the Japanese advanced like dominoes, arranged by fate itself. The soldiers who executed these campaigns had been indoctrinated since childhood in the Bushido Code, the way of the warrior. They had been taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that death in service of the emperor was the highest calling, that the Japanese spirit Yamato Damashi was superior to the materialistic decadence of the Western powers. They believed, because they had been told and shown, that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans, that American forces were soft, undisciplined, corrupted by luxury and individualism. In the training camps outside Tokyo and Osaka, in the barracks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instructors had described the Americans as weak-willed men who would crumble under pressure, who loved comfort more than duty, who would flee rather than fight when faced with true warriors. The early victories seemed to confirm this narrative. At Botan, tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops surrendered. At Wake Island, a handful of Japanese soldiers had overcome American defenders. The propaganda newspapers showed images of American prisoners with heads bowed, defeated. Hiroshi Tanaka had believed it all. He had volunteered for service in 1943, inspired by stories of glory, driven by a desire to serve Emperor Hirohito and defend the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. He imagined himself liberating Asian peoples from white colonial oppression. He imagined medals and honor, returning home to his village in Niigata Prefecture as a hero, perhaps even receiving a personal commendation written in the emperor's own hand. But that was before Guadalcanal, before Saipan and Peleliu and Iwo Jima. By January 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army was fighting a very different war than the one its soldiers had been promised. The victories had stopped. The American counteroffensive had transformed from a distant threat into an overwhelming reality, and the sky had begun to fill with things that Japanese anti-aircraft guns could not stop and Japanese fighters could not intercept. The Americans called it strategic bombardment. The Japanese soldiers on the receiving end had other names for it, names whispered in foxholes and bunkers, names that translated roughly to metal rain and fire from heaven and the end of the world. By 1945, the United States Army Air Forces had achieved something unprecedented in military history: complete aerial supremacy over the Pacific Theater. The numbers tell part of the story. In 1941, the entire U.S. Army Air Corps possessed approximately 2,500 aircraft. By 1945, American factories were producing more than 10,000 aircraft per month. Boeing B-29 Superfortresses rolled off assembly lines in Kansas and Washington state at a rate of 16 per day. Each one cost $640,000, more than 3 times the price of a B-17 Flying Fortress, and each one could carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs across distances that had previously been thought impossible. But numbers alone cannot capture what it meant to be on the ground when the bombers came. Hiroshi Tanaka's first experience with American aerial bombardment had occurred 6 months earlier, in July 1944, when his regiment was still stationed on Min. The warning had come from spotters stationed in the hills. Aircraft approaching from the east, Tanaka and his comrades had rushed to their positions, scanning the sky, expecting to see a dozen planes, perhaps 20 the size of raids they had heard about in training. Instead, they saw the horizon turn silver. There were not 20 planes. There were not 50. Formation after formation appeared, stacked at different altitudes, spreading across the entire visible sky like a flock of metal birds that stretched from one edge of vision to the other. Tanaka tried to count them and stopped at 60. His sergeant, a veteran of the China campaigns, simply stared upward and said nothing. The bombs fell like rain. Each explosion created a crater large enough to swallow 3 men. The earth heaved and buckled. Trees that had stood for a century were ripped from the ground and tossed aside like grass. The sound was beyond sound. It was a physical force that pressed against the chest and made ears bleed. Men who were not struck directly by explosives died from concussive force. Their internal organs ruptured by pressure waves. When it was over, after 30 minutes that felt like 30 hours, the landscape had been transformed. Where there had been a supply depot, there was now a field of craters. Where there had been a motor pool, there were twisted pieces of metal that might once have been trucks. Of the 140 men in Tanaka's company, 93 survived the raid. The wounded cried for water. The dead lay in pieces, scattered across a radius of 300 meters, and the Americans had not lost a single aircraft in the months that followed. Hiroshi Tanaka learned to recognize the different types of death that fell from American planes. There were the high-explosive bombs, which created the craters and the concussive waves. There were the incendiary bombs, which burned with a heat that turned sand into glass and made men combust like paper. There were the cluster bombs, which scattered smaller explosives across wide areas, making every inch of ground potentially lethal. And then there were the napalm strikes. Napalm, the word itself, became a whispered curse among Japanese soldiers, spoken with the same dread that ancient warriors might have reserved for plague or divine retribution. Napalm was jellied gasoline, a mixture of petroleum and chemical thickening agents that stuck to whatever it touched and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. When napalm canisters struck the ground, they created pools of liquid fire that could not be extinguished with water, that burned through clothing and into flesh, that consumed oxygen so rapidly that men suffocated even if the flames did not touch them directly the first time Tanaka saw napalm deployed. His unit had been dug into positions along a ridgeline overlooking what the Americans called the Villa Verde Trail. American ground forces had been making slow progress through the jungle, and Japanese commanders had ordered the ridge held at all costs. Tanaka and his comrades waited in their bunkers, conserving ammunition, preparing for the infantry assault they knew would come. The planes appeared at dawn, not the high-altitude bombers, but fighter bombers, flying low and fast. They came in waves, 6 aircraft at a time, sweeping across the ridge at treetop height. The canisters tumbled from their wings, end over end, almost lazy in their descent. Then they struck. The jungle erupted into walls of flame. The fire moved like a living thing, flowing down slopes, curling around trees, seeking fuel and oxygen with animal hunger. Men caught in the open vanished into the flames, their screams cut short. Those in bunkers faced a different horror. The fire consumed the air, creating vacuums that pulled the breath from lungs, that made men gasp like landed fish, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly. Tanaka survived because his foxhole was on the reverse slope, just beyond the edge of the flame spread. He watched his friends burn. He smelled the sweet, sick odor of cooking flesh. He heard the sounds men make when they are dying by fire. Sounds that are not quite screams and not quite words, but something in between. Something that should not come from human throats. After the flames died down, after the American ground forces advanced and the surviving Japanese soldiers retreated deeper into the mountains, Tanaka found himself unable to eat for 3 days. Every time he tried to swallow rice, he tasted ash. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw fire. This was not what they had told him war would be, the doctrine that guided Japanese military thinking in the early war. Years had been forged through decades of conflict with enemies who possessed rough parity in terms of equipment and industrial capacity. Japanese victories over China, over Russia in 1905, had been won through superior spirit, through willingness to sacrifice, through tactical excellence that compensated for material limitations. But the Pacific War revealed a terrible truth that Japanese commanders had not fully grasped. No amount of fighting spirit could overcome a 20-to-1 disadvantage in industrial production. No degree of tactical brilliance could compensate for an enemy that could afford to lose 10 bombers and replace them with 20 within a week. The United States, in 1945, was producing more steel in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year. American shipyards were launching aircraft carriers and battleships faster than Japanese submarines could sink them. American factories were manufacturing ammunition at such rates that artillery units were authorized to expend shells freely, without the constant calculations of scarcity that plagued Japanese forces. For soldiers like Hiroshi Tanaka, these statistics meant something very simple and very terrifying. The longer the war continued, the worse it would become. Each month, American firepower increased. Each month, the aerial bombardments intensified. Each month, the hope of victory or even honorable stalemate receded further into impossibility. The Japanese High Command's response to this reality was the doctrine of Gyokusai, shattering the jewel, a poetic term for suicidal last stands. If Japan could not defeat the Americans through industrial might, the reasoning went, Perhaps they could break American will through sheer bloodshed. Every island, every position, every foxhole would become a grave for American soldiers. The cost of conquering Japan would become so high that the Americans would negotiate a conditional peace rather than pay the price of total victory. It was a strategy built on a misunderstanding of American character, of American resolve, and most critically, of American willingness to find technological solutions to tactical problems. The Americans did not respond to heavy casualties by negotiating. They responded by bringing more firepower. January 17, 1945, San Manuel Luzon. Hiroshi Tanaka pressed his face into the dirt as the world above him transformed into hell. The flame and smoke had rolled across the defensive positions with the inevitability of a tide, and now the air itself seemed to be burning. He could feel the heat through the earth, could feel it radiating down into his foxhole like the breath of a furnace. The barrage had begun at dawn with artillery, American 155mm howitzers firing from positions miles away, their shells across the morning sky before plunging down onto Japanese positions with metronomic precision. Each shell created a fountain of earth and shrapnel, a brief volcano of violence. The artillery fire walked forward in neat lines, the American gunners adjusting their aim in methodical increments, ensuring that every square meter of ground received attention. Then had come the naval gunfire. Offshore, American destroyers and cruisers added their voices to the bombardment. The naval shells were larger, heavier, their explosions deeper and more profound. They created craters that would become ponds when the rains returned. The sound of their approach was different from artillery, a freight train rumble that gave perhaps 2 seconds of warning before impact. But it was the aircraft that truly terrified. The fighter bombers came first, strafing runs that turned the ground into a storm of bullets. 50-caliber machine gun rounds punched through sandbags, through wooden reinforcements, through the bodies of men who thought themselves safely concealed. Then came the bombers, not the high-altitude B-29s, but medium bombers flying low enough that Tanaka could see the individual rivets on their fuselages, could see the bomb bay doors opening, could see the canisters tumbling out, napalm and white phosphorus. High explosives and fragmentation bombs, a deliberate mixture designed to destroy different types of targets, to kill men in bunkers and men in trenches, men who were hiding and men who were running. The smoke rose, in pillars, hundreds of them, converging into a single black mass that blotted out the sun. The flames merged into a continuous wall, a barrier of fire that separated the living from the dead, the present from any conceivable future, and through it all, the sound, the endless mechanical roar of aircraft engines, the whistle and crack of falling ordnance, the deeper percussion of explosions, the screaming of wounded men, the secondary blasts of ammunition stores cooking off. Tanaka could not see what was happening 50 meters away. He could barely see the edge of his own foxhole. The smoke was so thick it was like being underwater, like drowning in ash. He tried to breathe through the cloth of his sleeve, but the fabric was already soaked with sweat and did nothing to filter the chemical stench of burning explosives and rubber and flesh. Time became meaningless. The barrage could have lasted 20 minutes or 2 hours. There was only the eternal present of survival, the desperate focus on drawing the next breath, on staying pressed against the earth, on not moving, not attracting attention, not being seen by the machines that ruled the sky. When the bombing finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise. Tanaka's ears rang with a high-pitched whine that would persist for days. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his head above the rim of his foxhole. The landscape had vanished. Where there had been a defensive line with interconnected positions, there was now a moonscape of overlapping craters. Where there had been trees, there were blackened stumps. Where there had been men, his friends, his squad leader, the kid from Kyoto who had shared his last cigarette 2 days ago. There were shapes that Tanaka's mind refused to recognize as human remains. And in the distance, through the smoke and haze, he could see them coming. American infantry, advancing in loose formation, their rifles held ready but almost casually, like hunters who knew the game had already been wounded and needed only to be finished off. The American soldiers' experience of this same battle was radically different, though few Japanese troops ever understood this disparity until it was too late. Where Hiroshi Tanaka saw an apocalyptic display of overwhelming force, the American I saw standard operating procedure, the minimum necessary preparation before infantry advance. Technical Sergeant James Morrison of the 25th Infantry Division had watched the barrage from a position 3 kilometers behind the front line, waiting for the signal to move forward. He had seen this pattern before, at New Georgia, at Bougainville, and most recently during the landing at Lingayen Gulf. The routine never varied. Airstrikes first, to destroy hardened positions, artillery next, to suppress any surviving defenses, naval gunfire to crater the landscape and destroy morale. Then the infantry advanced through the smoke, mopping up whatever remained. Morrison's squad carried new M1 Garand rifles, weapons they had received as replacements just a week earlier. Each man had a basic load of 80 rounds, plus grenades, plus whatever additional ammunition they could carry. They wore uniforms that had been issued fresh from supply depots, boots that fit properly, helmets with intact webbing, When they moved forward, they would do so with the confidence of men who knew that if they encountered serious resistance, they could call for fire support and have it arrive within minutes. The Japanese soldiers in their foxholes could call for nothing. Their artillery had been destroyed weeks ago or was rationed to a handful of shells per gun per day. Their air support was non-existent. The few remaining Japanese aircraft were being hoarded for kamikaze strikes against naval targets, not wasted on close air support for ground troops. Their supply lines had been cut by American submarines and aircraft, reducing their logistics to what could be carried on human backs through mountain trails. This asymmetry, this vast gulf between American abundance and Japanese scarcity was not an accident of war. It was the war. It was the fundamental reality that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. The Japanese soldiers who survived the bombardment at San Manuel faced a choice that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier: surrender or die. The Bushido Code demanded death. The propaganda they had been fed since childhood insisted that surrender meant torture and execution at the hands of barbaric Americans. But the reality of facing another bombardment, another day of waiting under a sky filled with enemy aircraft, was more terrifying than any abstract notions of honor. Hiroshi Tanaka made his choice on the morning of January 18th. His regiment, who remained of it, had been ordered to fall back to a new defensive line in the hills. But there was no defensive line. There was just more jungle, more open ground that American aircraft would turn into fire and craters. There was no hope of reinforcement, no prospect of relief, no possibility of victory or even survival. When the American infantry reached his position, Tanaka did not fire. He stood up slowly, his hands raised, his rifle left at the bottom of his foxhole. Around him, other soldiers made the same choice. Of the 230 men who had manned the defensive line at San Manuel, 19 surrendered. The rest were dead or had fled deeper into the mountains, where they would die over the following weeks from starvation and disease and in small, unrecorded skirmishes with American patrols. The American soldiers who accepted Tanaka's surrender were neither cruel nor particularly kind. They searched him for weapons, gave him water from their canteens, and directed him toward the rear where prisoners were being collected. One of them, a young private who looked barely old enough to shave, offered Tanaka a cigarette, a Lucky Strike, American tobacco, better than anything Tanaka had tasted in months. "Rough day, huh?" the American said, though Tanaka understood no English. What Tanaka did understand, in that moment with smoke still rising from the bombardment and American cigarette smoke mixing with it, was that everything he had been told about the Americans was a lie. They were not soft. They were not weak. They were not decadent or corrupted by material comfort. They were simply pragmatic. They had decided that overwhelming firepower was preferable to casualties, and they possessed the industrial might to implement that decision on a scale that defied comprehension. The terror that Japanese soldiers experienced when flame and smoke covered the sky was not merely physical fear of death. It was something deeper, the realization that they were fighting an enemy that operated by entirely different rules, that possessed resources so vast as to seem infinite, that could afford to expend in a single hour more explosives than the entire Japanese army had used in a week. This realization spread through the Japanese ranks like a contagion throughout 1945. On Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders who had been promised that their fortified positions would be impregnable watched as American battleships and bombers demolished every bunker, every gun position, every tunnel entrance. For 3 days before the landing, the island was subjected to the most intensive bombardment in the Pacific War. More than 450 ships fired over 15,000 shells, while aircraft dropped thousands of bombs. The volcanic rock itself seemed to liquefy under the assault. On Okinawa, the terror reached its apotheosis. The battle lasted 82 days and became a grotesque demonstration of what happened when Japanese determination to fight to the death met American willingness to deploy unlimited firepower. American forces fired 2.5 million artillery shells during the campaign. Naval vessels expended more than 3 million shells of various calibers. The air bombardment was continuous, day and night, transforming the island's landscape into a tableau that resembled photographs from the Western Front in 1917. A Japanese officer, Lieutenant Tadamichi Kurabayashi, who survived the early stages of the Okinawa campaign before dying in a banzai charge, left a diary that was recovered after the war. In his final entries, he described the psychological impact of the bombardment. The Americans make the earth shake for hours before their soldiers advance. We wait in our positions, knowing what is coming, powerless to stop it. The sound drives men mad. I have seen soldiers who showed no fear in battle weep like children when the bombers come. It is not the dying that terrifies. We are all prepared to die for the emperor. It is the helplessness. We are not warriors engaged in combat. We are targets being eliminated by machines. The symbolic object that came to represent American abundance to Japanese soldiers was not a weapon or a piece of military equipment. It was food, specifically canned food. the ubiquitous rations that every American soldier carried. Hiroshi Tanaka first encountered American food supplies 2 days after his surrender when he was being held in a temporary POW enclosure near Bo. The prisoners were given rations, not rice, not the fish and pickles they were accustomed to, but rectangular tins stamped with English words. Inside were things Tanaka had never seen: meat and thick gravy, crackers that were somehow still crisp, despite being sealed in cans, chocolate bars, cigarettes, even coffee. The portion size was what amazed him most. A single American ration contained more calories than a Japanese soldier's daily allotment, and the Americans had enough of these rations to feed not only their own troops but also their prisoners. The guards who supervised the POW enclosure ate the same rations as the prisoners. There was no special food for officers, no carefully hoarded luxuries. Everyone ate from identical tins, all of them fresh, none more than a few months old. For soldiers who had spent the last year eating half rations, who had watched their daily rice allowance shrink from 3 cups to 2 to 1 to half a cup, supplemented with whatever could be foraged from the jungle. This abundance was incomprehensible. It suggested an industrial base so vast, a logistics network so efficient, that food could be packaged in metal cans and transported across an ocean and distributed to millions of soldiers without anyone, anywhere, going hungry. One of Tanaka's fellow prisoners, a corporal who had served in China before being transferred to the Philippines, spent an entire evening examining an empty ration can, turning it over in his hands, marveling at the stamped metal and the rolled seam. "We have been fighting a nation that puts its food in metal," he said. "While we are eating grass soup, they are eating beef stew from tins. How did we ever think we could win?" The question had no answer, or rather, it had an answer that was too painful to speak aloud. They had thought they could win because they had been lied to, systematically and comprehensively, about the nature of the enemy and the reality of modern industrial warfare. The transformation in Japanese military thinking that occurred during 1945 was both profound and too late to matter. By the time soldiers like Hiroshi Tanaka understood the true nature of American military power, the war was already lost. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been destroyed at Leyte Gulf. The merchant marine that had supplied the empire's far-flung conquests had been gutted by American submarines. The home islands were being subjected to firebombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroyed entire cities. And yet the war continued, because to stop would require an acknowledgement that everything, the victories, the sacrifices, the promises, had been for nothing. Japanese commanders, trapped between ideological commitment and strategic reality, chose to continue fighting even as the evidence of defeat became overwhelming. For the soldiers on the ground, this meant more days of cowering in foxholes while the sky turned to flame and smoke. It meant more futile banzai charges against entrenched American positions. It meant more starvation, more disease, more death without purpose or glory. The psychological impact of this realization that death would come not in honorable combat, but under the impersonal weight of American industrial might, broke something fundamental in many Japanese soldiers. Some embraced the traditional codes more fiercely, using them as bulwarks against despair. Others became hollow-eyed and mechanical, going through the motions of resistance while waiting for the inevitable end. A few, like Tanaka, simply gave up their surrender, a quiet acknowledgement that the premises on which they had built their understanding of the war were false. In August 1945, 2 cities vanished in atomic fire, and the war ended. Hiroshi Tanaka learned of the surrender while still in the POW camp, which by then had grown into a sizable installation housing thousands of Japanese prisoners. The announcement was met with silence more than anything else. Not relief, not anger, just a vast, exhausted silence. Tanaka would spend 9 months in the camp before being repatriated to Japan. During that time, he learned to speak basic English. He watched American movies that were shown for the entertainment of guards and prisoners alike, flickering images of a country that seemed impossibly wealthy, where everyone had cars and houses and more food than they could eat. He listened to American radio broadcasts that described the Marshall Plan, America's intention to help rebuild not just its allies but also its former enemies. This generosity was perhaps more bewildering than the firepower had been. The nation that had possessed the industrial capacity to bury Japanese forces under avalanches of explosives also possessed the economic capacity to feed its conquered enemies, to rebuild their cities, to transform enmity into alliance. It suggested a way of thinking about power and resources that was fundamentally different from anything Tanaka had been taught. When he finally returned to Japan in May 1946, he found his country transformed beyond recognition. The cities he had known were gone, replaced by vast fields of rubble. Food was scarce. The emperor had renounced his divinity. The certainties that had shaped Japanese society, that had sent young men like Tanaka off to war, had been revealed as illusions. But he had also learned something that would shape the rest of his life, that ideological fervor and military courage were meaningless without the material foundation to support them, and that the modern world belonged to nations that could feed their people, clothe their soldiers, and manufacture Enough of everything that abundance itself became a weapon. The terror that Japanese soldiers experienced when flame and smoke covered the sky was not unique to them. It was the terror of all soldiers throughout history who found themselves outmatched, outgunned, fighting against forces they could not hope to defeat. What made the Pacific War distinctive was the scale of the disparity, the completeness of American material superiority, and the way that this superiority manifested not as isolated incidents but as a sustained, relentless, ever-intense bombardment that continued from 1943 through the war's end. Every major American offensive followed the same pattern. First, the sky would fill with aircraft, then the earth would shake with explosives. Then the survivors would face infantry advances supported by tanks, artillery, and on-call air support. Japanese commanders tried various tactics to counter this approach: dispersed defenses, underground fortifications, night attacks, kamikaze strikes, but none could overcome the fundamental problem. American forces could afford to lose and replace equipment and munitions faster than Japanese forces could destroy them. The psychological warfare inherent in this approach was likely unintentional but nonetheless effective. Each bombardment sent the same message: resistance is futile. Survival is impossible. The longer you fight, the worse it will become. For soldiers, raised in a culture that emphasized spiritual superiority over material considerations, this message was devastating precisely because it proved true again and again. The flame and smoke that terrified Japanese infantry was more than a tactical weapon. It was a manifestation of a larger truth about modern warfare: that industrial capacity and technological sophistication had become more important than individual courage or tactical excellence. The war in the Pacific was decided not on battlefields but in factories, not by generals but by engineers and assembly line workers, not by the quality of soldiers but by the quantity of weapons and supplies that could be delivered to the front. Decades after the war, historians would analyze the Pacific campaign through various lenses: strategic, tactical, political, cultural. They would debate the necessity of the atomic bombs, the morality of strategic bombing, the racial dimensions of the conflict. But for soldiers like Hiroshi Tanaka, who lived through the terror of those bombardments, the experience remained stubbornly simple. They had been sent to fight a war that could not be won, against an enemy whose capabilities exceeded anything they had been prepared to face. And when the flame and smoke covered the sky, all the ideology and training in the world could not prevent the mind from understanding a truth the body already knew: that death was coming, impersonal and inevitable, delivered by machines operated by men they would never see. Tanaka lived until 1998. He never spoke much about his war experience to his children or grandchildren. He became a schoolteacher, specializing in mathematics, taking satisfaction in precision and verifiable truth. He followed American politics with interest, watched the Apollo moon landings with a mixture of wonder and recognition. Of course, they could do it. The same industrial might that had buried Japanese positions under tons of explosives could certainly manage to put men on the moon. In his later years, when pressed, he would sometimes describe what it had been like in that foxhole near San Manuel, watching the sky turn black at noon, feeling the earth shake, understanding that he was about to die not because he had fought poorly but because he was fighting for a nation that could not match its enemy's capacity to manufacture death on an industrial scale. "I was terrified," he would say, "but not of dying. I was terrified because I realized that everything I believed about the war, about Japan, about our enemies, all of it was wrong. And if that was wrong, what else had been a lie?" The sky above San Manuel cleared eventually. The smoke dissipated. The fires burned themselves out. The craters filled with rainwater and became ponds where farmers would plant rice again. Once the war ended and the land could be reclaimed, the physical scars healed relatively quickly, as they always do. But the psychological scars, the understanding that modern war had become something beyond human scale, that survival depended less on skill or courage than on which side possessed more factories and refineries, those scars remained. They shaped Japanese pacifism in the post-war years, influenced the nation's decision to rebuild as an economic rather than military power, informed a generation's understanding of what kind of war should be fought and what kind should be avoided at all costs. The flame and smoke that covered the sky above the Philippines in January 1945 was ultimately not about Japan or America specifically. It was about the transformation of warfare itself, about the moment when industrial capacity became the decisive factor in armed conflict, about the terrible efficiency of nations that could afford to expend thousands of tons of explosives to avoid losing hundreds of soldiers. And in that transformation, in that moment when Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka pressed his face into the dirt and felt the heat of napalm radiating through the earth, there was a truth being written not about courage or honor or ideology, but about the cold mathematics of modern power, that the nation which can make the most of everything will eventually defeat the nation that makes the most of what it has. The sky turned black at noon, the earth shook. Men died in fire and smoke and crushing pressure. And when it was over, the only thing that remained was the understanding that some wars cannot be won through spirit alone, and that the price of discovering this truth is measured in lives and cities and illusions burned away until only ash remains. This is what the flame and smoke taught those who survived to see the sky clear again. Not that war is hell, that truth is ancient, but that modern war is something stranger and more terrible. A thing of mathematics and factories in an abundance, so vast it can be weaponized. So complete that even surrender becomes a revelation of just how thoroughly one's understanding of the world had been mistaken. And perhaps that is the final terror, not the bombs themselves, but what they represent: a world transformed beyond recognition, where old codes of honor become irrelevant, where courage cannot overcome logistics, where the sky itself becomes the domain of machines that rain down death with the dispassion of a monsoon, inevitable and impersonal and endless until someone decides it should stop. The smoke cleared, the war ended. The survivors went home to a country that had to be rebuilt from ashes, literal and metaphorical. And in quiet moments, in dreams, in the sound of aircraft passing overhead on commercial flights, they remembered the way the sky turned black at noon, the way the earth became fire, the way everything they believed proved insufficient against a power they had not imagined possible. This is the story Flame and Smoke wrote across the sky in January 1945. This is what Japanese infantry learned in those foxholes and bunkers, waiting for the bombs to fall, that the modern world belongs to those who can manufacture abundance. And that abundance, when weaponized, is the most terrifying thing of all.